When last we met, we left off at the end of Acts, which is the last of the New Testament's historical books. The historical narrative of the New Testament drops off there in the book of Acts, and everything else we kind of know about the development of the church. Beyond that, we get from church history, church tradition. It kind of helps fill in some gaps as best as it can. Where we are going to be starting off and tonight finishing our walkthrough of all of the books of the Bible is in the letters or the epistles. And we start with the book of Romans. Now, a quick word about these letters, especially related to Paul's letters. They are not ordered chronologically. I'm curious, does anybody know what order the letters are in the New Testament?
Is it longest or shortest?
It is. It's just by length. They're really original, the church, putting their book together. Yeah, it's Paul's longest letters to his shortest letters, with the little caveat of his letters to individuals are placed after his letters to churches. If you wanted to read Paul's letters chronologically, I'll give you what you need to do to be able to do that tonight by letting you know about when each of them was written. But you would probably be starting in Galatians and then bouncing around quite a bit. So Romans was written by Paul, the apostle, and we talked about him a little bit last week when we talked about Acts. A contributor to the book of Romans was Tertius. Romans chapter 16:22 says, "I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord." And that's an important point because most of Paul's letters were actually put to paper by somebody else, like a transcriptionist or a secretary. The technical word for it in the ancient Greco-Roman world was an amanuensis. That's a $5 word you don't need to remember, but that was someone who had a job of doing this, and Tertius was that person for the book of Romans. The occasion, like when this book was written, just again, another kind of general note about Paul's letters, the dates for different events in Paul's life are a little hard for us to pin down because he was not a historically important person during his lifetime. He was not a governor. He wasn't some, military commander. So people weren't like keeping track of Paul and what he was up to. It wasn't until after the church really expanded and Christianity grew that Paul became this historically important figure. So we base what we know about Paul's life, and so kind of when his letters were written, based on a few historical markers that Luke gives us in the book of Acts. So the years I'm going to give you for when these letters were written, they're all approximate. It's within, 2 or 3 years of when that was. The book of Romans was written by Paul from Corinth around 57 AD. This would have been near the end of his third missionary journey. And it was written to believers in Rome who Paul had not visited before, but he anticipated doing so. So that kind of sets this letter apart from a lot of his others. A lot of the letters Paul writes were to churches that he helped start and was writing, he had personal relationships inside of those churches. Here, Paul, he knew a few people just from his journeys who were a part of the church in Rome, but he had never been there personally. So he was hopeful that by sending them this letter and making this introduction, he could go to Rome and they would help him go then even further in his ministry. His hope was that they would support him in traveling all the way to Spain. So that's what kind of sets Romans apart, and what gives Romans its flavor, that it is sort of the grand survey we have of Paul's theology. He starts from the beginning and brings them all the way through, which is why if you really want to have a good handle on what Paul believes and really get a good walkthrough of kind of the New Testament Christian faith, Romans is probably the best book to start in. Paul discusses the sinfulness of humanity. He discusses the righteousness of God. He talks about how God can declare sinners righteous based on the sacrifice of Jesus. He talks about holy living that comes through Christ and how we don't face condemnation anymore because of Christ. He discusses the Jewish people, his own people's apparent hardness to the message of Jesus, and he discusses kind of his desire and his belief that eventually they will come to know Jesus and be brought back into the fold. And then he finishes the book of Romans. The last section is on living as a Christian in an unchristian world. From Romans, we move on to 1 Corinthians. Again, it was written by Paul, a contributor noted in 1 Corinthians as Sosthenes. It was written around 55 AD, so a couple years before the book of Romans, for those of you who are maybe keeping track. And Paul wrote this from Ephesus. It was written to the Christians who were living in Corinth, where there was a church that Paul had founded and where he had actually lived with them for a good bit of time. He lived with them for a few years, and this is a letter that he was sending to them. In Corinth, things had gotten really messy. And Paul was writing to help them through that, to set them straight on a number of issues. He speaks against division. In the book of 1 Corinthians, he talks about unaddressed sin problems in the church. Paul seems to answer a number of questions that the Corinthians had in the book. He seems to have gotten some sort of message from them, and then he goes on to answer their questions, talking to them about marriage, talking about Christian freedom of behavior, talking about how to conduct orderly worship services. He touches on spiritual gifts. He touches on the importance of building one another up and loving each other. And then he ends that letter with a lengthy section about their hope because of the resurrection of Jesus. In 2 Corinthians, again, this was Paul, and Timothy is listed as having been with him and potentially contributed to this letter a little bit. And this was written maybe about a year later, around 56 AD, while Paul was in Macedonia. Titus, another disciple of Jesus and someone who had worked closely with Paul, Titus had brought Paul good news about the Corinthians. Like, Paul had sent them a tough letter. We also get the impression that maybe Paul had spent a very short, he said that he had a short, painful visit with them. So it's possible that after he sent his letter, he was able to then go to them, and between getting a really tough letter from him and having what he called a short, painful visit, they didn't depart on the best of terms. 2 Corinthians is Paul's response to the fact that Titus came and he says, hey, things are actually going a lot better. And so Paul, in that letter, he spends some time just discussing with them the different experiences he's had. He shares his philosophy of ministry in the letter of 2 Corinthians. He teaches on financial giving in anticipation that he's going to come back and he's going to take up a collection for other believers who were in need. So a lot of what we get about kind of like church generosity comes out of that letter of 2 Corinthians. Paul defends his apostleship. So there were still people kind of rolling around in Corinth saying, do we really need to listen to this Paul guy? And so he kind of defends himself as being in a proper place to instruct the Corinthians, and specifically against some people who were sort of speaking out against him and questioning his teaching and leadership there. All right, moving on down, we get to the book of Galatians. Again, the author is Paul. Contributors, we know that there was an unnamed scribe because, just again, like a little interesting note, in Galatians 6:11, you'll read a verse that says, "Look at what large letters I use as I write to you in my own handwriting." So it's like someone else had been writing the letter to the Galatians very neatly, and then Paul wanted to be like, "Look, I'm contributing too." So, but because of that, again, we know that there was a scribe involved. The occasion, Galatians is probably the first letter from Paul that we have. It's probably the oldest of Paul's letters, written near the end of the 40s, maybe around 49 AD, while Paul was in Antioch. That was kind of his home base. This would have been after his first missionary journey, when he would have first gone to the Galatia region, but before his second missionary journey. And it was written to churches in that region of Galatia, which is modern-day kind of central Turkey, for those of you who know your geography at all. And he had visited them, like I said, on that first journey. And the occasion for this first letter is that there were some Jewish Christians who had come in behind Paul getting the churches started, who were telling the new Gentile believers that they had to become circumcised and they had to follow the law if they wanted to be true Christians and really be saved. Paul condemns this strongly as a false gospel, and his book of Galatians is really reiterating to them that their salvation is by grace, and that what followers of God have always needed is faith, and that Jesus set us free from the law. And so now we live by the power of the Spirit. And Galatians includes a very famous passage on the fruit of the Holy Spirit, what we would expect to see coming out of a true believer's life. Okay, and then so after Galatians, we have Ephesians. So Ephesians from Paul comes to us from definitely a different time frame. It was written around 61 AD while Paul was imprisoned in Rome. It's one of the four, what we call the prison epistles. That's Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Were all written during this same imprisonment period. We talked about this a little bit, I know, before, whenever we were talking about manuscripts. Though it is addressed to the Ephesians in some of the ancient manuscripts, it's not addressed to the Ephesians in the copies that we have that are closest to the original. So it is more likely that this was kind of a general letter. It was a letter that got circulated among multiple churches, and because it also doesn't address any congregation-specific problems. And Paul spent a lot of time in Ephesus, so he would have had some pretty close relationships there. So again, odds are this was a letter that was kind of working its way around to a lot of churches, one of which would have been the churches there in Ephesus. Overview of this letter, the focus of this letter is on growing and strengthening the church. Paul emphasizes salvation by grace through faith and how Christ tears down all of the things that previously divided believers. He encourages the believers to care for each other, and he talks to them about the importance of their conduct toward unbelievers. He talks about Christian marriages and parenting and working relationships. And then he concludes with another famous passage about putting on the armor of God. You know, if you've heard of that one or wonder where to locate, that's in Ephesians. And putting on the armor of God in order to stand strong in the faith. Philippians. So again, Philippians, written by Paul. Timothy, listed as a contributor there with him, and it was written probably around 62 AD. We think a little later than Ephesians, but it was another of those prison letters while Paul was imprisoned in Rome. It was written to the church in Philippi after they had sent a man named Epaphroditus to Paul with a support gift from the church. So this was a response letter to someone who had specifically come from the Philippian church with a gift for kind of helping to take care of Paul while he was a prisoner, which sets the tone for the whole letter because Paul thanks the Philippians for their care for him and their partnership. It's probably the most positive letter that we have from Paul. Just comes off as very gracious, and he encourages them to rejoice despite their sufferings and their hardships, just letting them know, the message of the gospel is moving forward, and he just encourages them to keep doing the work and keep following the example of Jesus. He encourages them to persevere and to be content no matter what they're going through. Is Paul's running theme throughout the book of Philippians is just like maintain your joy in following Jesus despite all of the stuff that's in front of you. And then there's Colossians. So Colossians, again, written by Paul. Timothy listed as there with him as well. This one, so if we're talking about kind of the order of when we think Paul sent his prison letters, it was probably Colossians and Philemon together. Ephesians, because it and Colossians are very similar. It seems like Paul was kind of fleshing out and giving a lot more generalities in Ephesians, and then Philippians, probably the last of those prison letters that he wrote. So this one was written, Colossians was written around 61 AD. It was written to the church in Colossae after Paul had received news that false teaching was threatening the well-being of the church there. And so in that letter, Paul emphasizes the importance and the divine nature of Christ. He's trying to clean up their theology. He addresses how various false teachings, and he kind of calls out a few of them: mysticism, asceticism, legalism, how those things don't align with the saving message of the gospel. And then he gets into some practical matters, similar ones to the ones that he talks about in Ephesians: putting off sin, loving each other well, being a Christian as a spouse, as a parent, as a child, as a boss, as an employee, as neighbors, how to be Christians in all of those settings. All right, 1 Thessalonians. So 1 Thessalonians, again, written by Paul. Contributors are Silvanus, or you also know his name maybe as Silas. He goes by both. And Timothy are both mentioned in 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 1. This would have been another one of Paul's earlier letters. So if you were trying to go chronologically, you would probably go Galatians and then 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. It was written around 50 AD while Paul was in Corinth. It was written to a church that Paul founded, and you can actually read about all of this in the book of Acts. Like, this whole story is laid out. Paul went to Thessalonica on his second missionary journey. He and Silas were together, and Timothy was with them. And they started a church, but they were only able to stay there for a really short amount of time before they got run out of town. And so 1 Thessalonians is a letter that Paul wrote after he received news from Timothy that the church was actually doing really good in spite of facing the persecution that was the same thing that ran Paul and Silas out of town. So in the letter, he commends the Thessalonians for their faith in the face of hardship. He encourages them, tries to give them some practical and moral instruction, maybe the kind of instruction that Paul would have given them had he been able to stay with them longer. We see some of that in 1 Thessalonians. He also addresses some concerns that it seems like maybe Timothy brought to him that the people had about the return of Jesus. They were kind of worried about, how is this going to work? Or is it possible we already, like, Jesus came back and we missed it? Or what happens what happens to people who die before Jesus comes back? Do they get to be with him? And so he's addressing some of those questions that they seem to have about the return of Jesus, which leads right into 2 Thessalonians, because it seems like 2 Thessalonians was written very shortly after 1 Thessalonians, right around that same 50 AD time frame. It is a direct follow-up to his first letter. Apparently he sent it. They had more confusion communicated back to him specifically about that idea of Jesus' return and how all that was going to work. And so it's like he immediately penned 2 Thessalonians and sent it right back to him. Paul assures the church, you have not missed Jesus' return. If he had come back, this is how it's going to go. You would have known. And then he gives them kind of a look at some end times events that are going to take place before that day Jesus returns. So until then, he just encourages them, keep doing what's right. All right, so then another kind of swing in the timeline for Paul when we go over to 1 Timothy. We think that 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy are probably the last letters that we have from Paul. Different Bible scholars will give you different ideas about the timeline of this. I personally think that these three letters all come from after the book of Acts. And we got time. Depending on who you're asking, some people will say that the book of Acts ends and that Paul was martyred shortly thereafter. He was a prisoner in Rome, and that his death came shortly after Luke concludes the book of Acts. Others, and I would put myself in this camp, are more along the lines that Paul was actually released from being a prisoner in Rome. He actually did some of the further traveling that he talked about wanting to do in the book of Romans. Eventually was imprisoned again, which is why he's not imprisoned in 1 Timothy. He doesn't seem to be imprisoned in Titus, and he seems to be back in prison in 2 Timothy. So he was imprisoned again, and then it was after 2 Timothy that he was martyred. We don't know for sure. That's my take on it. So in 1 Timothy, it was written probably around 63-ish AD from Macedonia. Again, I'm going to say after Paul's first Roman imprisonment, but before his second. You can take that with a grain of salt. And it was written to Timothy, who was helping the churches in Ephesus at the time. And in this letter, Paul is guiding Timothy on leading the church. He warns him against false teachers. He gives him qualifications for church leaders. This is where we find some of what we look at when we select elders and deacons or ministers for our churches. He instructs on how to minister to and among a few different age groups and with widows. And he warns about contentment and warns about not getting too focused on money or worldly gain. It's a great kind of church leader's guide for how he was trying to help Timothy set that up. 2 Timothy, and if I was doing this the way I wanted to, I would jump to Titus because it goes next, but it doesn't go next in our Bible, so I'll stick with 2 Timothy. All right, so 2 Timothy, Paul wrote this around 64 to 65 AD, again, while he was imprisoned in Rome, I believe for the second, but either way, imprisoned in Rome for the final time. He wrote it to Timothy. This was actually him requesting Timothy to come to him. It is likely the last letter that we have from Paul before he was martyred. He's asking Timothy to come visit him. He's encouraging Timothy to persevere in the faith. He's warning about apostasy, people falling away from the faith, and about false teaching coming into the church. He emphasizes the importance to Timothy of preaching the word, and he recognizes in that letter that his own race seems to be coming to an end. Then Titus, so again, back up time frame just slightly. This was written around 63 AD. When Paul, it's fuzzy from the text, he was either in or he was planning to travel to Nicopolis, which, we don't hear about that in the book of Acts, which is kind of what leads me and others to believe that this was after. It was written to Titus, who was a co-worker of his, who was leading churches on the island of Crete. And Paul encourages Titus, much in the same way he does Timothy in 1 Timothy. He encourages him on installing elders for the church. It gives him some advice on dealing with people who were making trouble in the church. And he instructs him how to help the Christians there with their Christian behavior toward one another and towards the unbelieving world around them. It's just another church leader guide. And then lastly, the last letter that we know for sure is from Paul is the letter of Philemon. And he lists that Timothy is with him. So for the time frame on Philemon, jump back to Colossians. This was written around 61 AD while Paul was imprisoned in Rome. It is written to an individual named Philemon, who is an affluent believer in the city of Colossae. It was probably delivered at the same time the letter of Colossians was delivered, because Paul specifically mentions sending that with two men named, I don't know that I'm going to get this right, Tychicus and Onesimus. And that name Onesimus is really important that it shows up at the end of Colossians, because Philemon is a letter to Philemon, and Onesimus was Philemon's slave who had run away. And while Onesimus was in Rome, he met Paul and became a Christian. And so Paul was writing this letter to encourage Philemon to show Onesimus grace. And who was carrying this letter from Paul but Onesimus himself. And he was just asking that he would show him grace, not show him punishment, and that he would welcome him back as a brother in Christ. So, fascinating little letter. All right. Any questions about Paul's letters? At least the ones that we know are definitely from Paul. All right, then Hebrews, and this is why I keep saying the ones we know are definitely from Paul. So the book of Hebrews, or the letter of Hebrews, is anonymous. Common opinion is that the material is from Paul, or if not Paul, one of his close associates. And pick a name out of the book of Acts, and someone has probably suggested it as a possible author of Hebrews. Barnabas, Priscilla and Aquila, Apollos, Luke, all have been suggested, all for just various reasons that we're not going to get into tonight. Or could have just been Paul. Likely, this was written prior to 70 AD, and our only reason for thinking that is that the Jewish temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, and that is it is hard for us to really put an understanding on the amount of just cultural impact that would have had to Jewish people, even Jewish Christians. And so for a massive event like that not to be mentioned or really even alluded to in the book leads us to believe that this letter came before that event happened. But as far as how far before, when this happened, we don't know for sure. It was written to Jewish believers, that's why it's called Hebrews, who seem to be having second thoughts about following Jesus. Quick overview. Hebrews, it really urges Jewish Christians not to return to the law as a means of salvation. You know, being a Jew in the Roman Empire was a privileged religious status. The Romans were not particularly hostile to Jews in practicing their own faith. Being a Christian was not a privileged religious status, and they faced persecution for it. They were doing some grass is greener thinking. It was like, man, things were not this hard whenever we were just kind of keeping the law and doing all of the Hebrew things. And so they were thinking about going back. And Paul just urges them, you can't go back. There's no salvation back in the old law for you. Hebrews argues for the superiority of Christ to the old covenant in every way, and he warns of the eternal consequences if you abandon Christ. Hebrews encourages the believers to endure through persecution. He encourages them to follow the example of all of these famous names throughout the Bible who lived by faith, the people who came before them, and tries to give that to them to encourage them to just keep going. After Hebrews, we come to the letter from James. So there are several Jameses mentioned in the New Testament. This James is the half-brother of Jesus. He was a leader in the early church. The first James that we meet is James, the brother of John. He was one of the 12 disciples. He was killed. He was the first of the 12 disciples who was martyred. You can read about that. It's real brief, but in Acts chapter 12, verse 2. This James is the one that we pick up with in the middle of Acts, who was a leader in the church. And like I said, our church history tells us that he was the half-brother of Jesus. He was the son of Mary and Joseph. Written, honestly, the letter of James could have been written any time from the 40s to the 60s AD. It could be, I'm inclined to think, that it is maybe the earliest book of the New Testament that we have. And the reason for thinking that is that it is very much written to a Jewish Christian audience, and it does not seem to address any issues between Jews and Gentiles in the church, which kind of leads us to believe maybe there weren't yet Gentiles, or at least very many Gentiles in the church, which would put this letter very early as far as when James wrote it. It's addressed specifically to the 12 tribes in dispersion. So Jewish Christians who had been spread out throughout the Roman Empire because of just circumstances. An overview of James. James is a highly practical letter about living as a follower of Jesus. It addresses facing suffering and difficulty, living out your faith and not just believing, controlling your speech, seeking God for wisdom, not showing favoritism for rich or influential people in the church, patience, and praying for each other. Highly practical book of James. 1 Peter. So 1 Peter was written by Peter, or Simon Peter, one of Jesus' 12 disciples. A contributor is Silvanus, or Silas. See 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 12. Name checks him. It was written to the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So specifically names the cities that Peter was writing to. And Peter says he's writing from Babylon. Now, Babylon didn't really exist anymore at this point. Babylon, we get the impression that the Christians use that as a byword for Rome, sort of like I guess sort of a code, if you will, that they used for it. And so we know that Christians had been scattered by the persecution of the Emperor Nero. This would have been near the early 60s AD, and because of that scattering that happened, we get the impression that Peter is there in Rome and that he is writing this letter out to the Christians who have been sort of ejected from Rome. And 1 Peter is an instruction for Christians living as aliens and foreigners in non-Christian lands, and it's kind of a double meaning, because they are the foreigners in that they were from Rome, but they kind of had to leave. But more so, they are of Christ, and they live in the world that is not of Christ. So you all are living as foreigners in this land that you're in now. So he reminds them of their hope for salvation, and he calls them to live in a holy way, specifically in dealing with their local governments and in dealing with their employers, and as family members among each other, live as followers of Jesus in all of these spheres. And he instructs the church leaders in this letter on how to lead, and the whole church on how to treat each other as they all eagerly awaited the return of Jesus. Now, 2 Peter, written by Peter, but I'll mention that as far as contributors go, Silvanus is not mentioned this time, and that's significant to the letter of 2 Peter, because the style of 2 Peter is very different than the style of 1 Peter. We don't notice this stuff because we read it in English and we don't pick up on it, but people who kind of know their ancient Greek, they do. And there are some who question the authorship of 2 Peter because it just stylistically is so different than 1 Peter. But a very simple question to that is, well, that's because Silvanus was actually the one who was penning the first one, and maybe Peter himself wrote the second one, and Peter wasn't. I mean, he was a fisherman, and so it's going to maybe come with a different style than if it was written by a professional scribe like Silvanus may have been. Possibly 2 Peter has some level of collaboration with Jude, whether that's like they talked about it or one of them had knowledge of the other book. There's just a lot of crossover themes in 2 Peter and Jude, but we can't say for sure which direction that crossover seems to be coming from. There's no specific audience that's mentioned, so this was just meant to be a general letter to the church, written sometime before Peter's death in the mid-60s AD. And 2 Peter encourages Christians to keep growing in their faith and to be on the lookout against false teachers and also those who keep returning to sinful lifestyles. Peter reminds them that Jesus is returning, even if some are scoffing at the fact that he hasn't yet. People were already, it had been, 30 years, and people were already starting to say, oh yeah, you say this Jesus is coming back. I don't think so. So he was writing to encourage them. And he talks to them about how this is actually the patience of God on display, that God doesn't want people to perish, but he wants more to come to repentance. All right, 1 John. So 1 John is an anonymous letter, as was the fourth gospel, if you remember from last week, also anonymous. But the author of 1 John claims to be an eyewitness to Jesus. 1 John shares the style and themes with the Gospel of John, and it was attributed to John the disciple by all of the early church fathers. So you kind of put 2 + 2 + 2 together, and we get John as the author of this letter. No specific audience was given here either, but John was ministering at this time to churches in and around Ephesus, so this letter was likely written to them sometime in the 80s to 90s AD. So we've jumped forward a couple of decades in the history of the church, just like we did with John's gospel itself, jumping forward quite a bit of historical distance between the other gospels and it. 1 John discusses how those who truly belong to Christ will seek fellowship with others that he's saved, how true Christians will walk in the light and not in darkness. They'll confess sin and they'll obey God's word and see a decreasing pattern of sin in their lives. A big thing for 1 John is that true Christians will demonstrate love for one another. If you want to know whether someone is kind of really in or really out, look at how they're loving each other. And in all of this, he just is trying to give Christians confidence in the eternal life that is to come. 2 John, the author of 2 John identifies himself just as the elder, but again, stylistically, there's a lot that ties it to 1 John, and traditionally it was always identified as being John the Apostle. 2 John, rather, is framed as though it was writing to a lady and her children, so it's possible that it was being literal about that those were the literal recipients. It's also possible that maybe this was a metaphor for the church and the people in the church. We don't know for sure. It was likely that this was again written in the 80s to 90s AD. 2 John's really quick reminder to the recipients to walk in love and to watch out for those who are trying to bring false teaching to the church about Jesus. And usually 3 John is like on the same page as 2 John because they're both really short letters. And again, 3 John is attributed, or the author calls himself the elder. Traditionally, we believe that to be John. It was written to an individual. It was written to a man named Gaius. Presumably, he was an early church leader, written around the same time frame as the other 2 John letters. In this, again, really brief letter, Gaius is commended for his treatment of visiting believers, and he's encouraged to keep it up. Because another man in the church named Diotrephes, he needed to be rebuked because he was being prideful and he was opposed to caring for these visitors coming to the church, and had even had a run-in with the author, with John himself. Jude. So Jude lists himself as the author of his letter, and he calls himself Jude, the brother of James. And we take that to mean the James who wrote the letter of James. So Jude being another half-brother of Jesus. Again, as far as contributors go, it seems like there's some interaction with or knowledge of 2 Peter. We don't really know for sure kind of how those two cross-pollinated. The occasion, it's written to Christians with a general bent towards Jewish Christians because Jude references the Old Testament a lot, and he actually references some non-scriptural Jewish writings. Like he even pulls out some of those books that we talked about way back when we talked about canon. Jude kind of makes some side references to those. Seems like this letter was written, again, around the time of 2 Peter, so probably in the mid-60s, if not later than that. Jude's emphasis is on false teaching and false teachers, people who are claiming to be Christians, but who are teaching what's contrary to the truth. They create division, they seek to benefit themselves, and Jude encourages the church not to let them, but to help those who are wavering in their faith. Any questions about we call them the general epistles. That's basically all of the ones that weren't written by Paul. All right, so we got 11 minutes. Let's talk about Revelation. All right, so Revelation, the author was John. It was written from the island of Patmos, where John had been exiled as punishment for spreading the faith. Church tradition tells us that they actually tried to kill John, but it didn't take. And so they exiled him whenever the killing didn't seem to work. The letter of Revelation was specifically written to 7 named churches within the letter. 7 churches in Asia Minor, probably the 90s AD. Everything we know about this letter is it is the last letter of the New Testament to be written chronologically, as well as being the last letter of the New Testament that we have. So just kind of a reminder, genre for this, it is a letter, but it's also prophecy. It also takes on the genre that we talked about of an apocalypse, which was a specific kind of writing that we'll get into a little bit here again tonight. Apocalypses, like Revelation, were a type of Jewish literature where symbolic visions were used to reveal a heavenly perspective on history and current events, so that the present could be viewed in light of, say this and then perhaps say it again, the present could be viewed in light of history's final outcome. So the idea of an apocalypse was, it's like we're pulling back the curtain. It's like you see all of this stuff that's happening in front of you, but if you look here and you look behind the scenes, this is what's been happening throughout history. This is what's happening to you now, but you can look at all of this and know that this is what's going to happen in the future because of what we know about God. Revelation has a high use of numbers and symbols. These are all drawn from the Old Testament. They are not some kind of secret code for discovering the events at the end of the world. What they are is a code telling you, hey, you should go back and read these prophets. Like, read what they were saying. When you see an image here and it reminds you of something there, go read there. And that's going to give you an idea of what's going on in the book of Revelation. Written to encourage the readers to go to those biblical texts. It was written to these churches about what they were going through. And while it still speaks to what we are going through today, it will likely lead you to wild speculation if you try really hard to superimpose a specific vision from Revelation onto a specific event happening in our time. I'm not saying that it's impossible that those things are true. I'm just saying you could also be really far off trying to do that. It was about, all we know for sure, it was about events that were happening in their time, many of which have patterns that get repeated down throughout history until Jesus comes back. So, that's kind of my overview of my overview. The actual overview for the book of Revelation is that it opens up with John specifically addressing each of the 7 churches, talking to them about various successes and various failures going on in their congregation, and in their holding tightly to the faith. John then shares a vision that he had of God's throne room and this worship that was happening in heaven, and how God is holding a scroll with 7 seals, like wax seals on this scroll. And in heaven's throne room, there's sort of a moment of lament, like who can open this scroll? And then they say that it's the conquering one. The conquering one from the tribe of Judah and from the family of David can open the scroll. And John turns to look and see who is this conquering one from the tribe of Judah, from the family of David. And he looks, and what he sees looks like a slaughtered lamb. And we know that that's Jesus. And it says that he is worthy of opening the scrolls. And that's what leads then into the bulk of the book of Revelation, with these cycles of 7 seals, 7 bowls that get poured out, 7 trumpets that get blown, all bringing cycles of God's judgment to the earth. Now, some interpret this as sequential events. They're like 7 events happen, then 7 events happen, then 7 events. Others view this as the same sequence of event being told from 3 different perspectives. Take your pick. We see war and famine and disease. We see a lack of repentance on the part of many. We get an idea of what's going on behind the scenes. We kind of see some of like the spiritual warfare that was going on and how that was leading to wickedness on the earth. We see how nations continue to do what Babylon once did, seeking military and economic power in rebellion against God. We see how some continue to bear witness to God and try to get people to turn to him. And that's kind of like, that's John's end thing, like, hey, I'm writing to the church. That's you. That's what you're doing in the midst of all this. And these are the difficulties that you're facing. And then finally, at the end, Jesus returns in triumph. Evil gets defeated, earth gets remade, like all of the promises are fulfilled, and those who were faithful to Jesus get to reign with him in eternity forever. And that was really the big focus of hope that John was trying to get the church to. This is all you're going through. This is what's waiting for us. So not next Wednesday, but the Wednesday after that. So it's the first Wednesday in December. I believe it is the 4th of December. We will be back here for our last lesson. Like I said, I've got probably half to 2/3 of our time together, material for that. If you have more Bible questions, just like whether it's reading your Bible stuff or maybe just even some more kind of nuanced stuff that we haven't gotten into, please bring them. And if we have time, we'll talk about them. And if we don't have anything to talk about, we'll call it a night. All right, so good? All right, thanks everybody.